And I explain what I think is a plausible, humane, reasonable rights claim within trans. But I also say, don't think it's obvious that that goes on to experimenting on children, and assume that successive generations after us will not look back and think, wow, wow. I mean, just look at that bit of footage the other day from the LGBT town hall of the Democrats, when a mother is standing there beside a child, and the child introduces themselves to Elizabeth Warren and says, I'm a 9-year-old trans child. And Elizabeth Warren and everyone else in the room just whoops. Whoops. I think we can stick to being polite where and when we can, but this is where an unwillingness to actually interrogate complex, difficult, tricky terrain leads you. It leads you to the situation of everyone cheering at an idea we didn't have a few years ago and needs to be interrogated properly.
I wonder whether, I think where I might part company slightly is I think, as opposed to looking back on this and seeing where, I think we know this is wrong, generally as a society. I think we know it at the moment. I think we have a bizarre situation where the minority of social justice activists, or those with that mindset, seem to have so much power and ability to dominate the media narrative that we're in this kind of illusory world where we think this is the norm. I think the vast majority of people, and this is something I wanted to ask you about, because I think we're winning. I think there's something to be very optimistic about.
Oh, for sure.
I don't believe that we are living in this oppressive matrix world that they think we are. And I think, therefore, it is doomed to die.
I agree, but there might be an awful lot of pain to get through first. I come back to this thing. If you are working in government or in a large number of an increasing number of companies and elsewhere, you are already stuck in the matrix of not being able to have employment decisions based on competency, but at the very least significantly dominated by characteristic discussions. And once that is embedded, the truth is that we can laugh about it all we want, but if they decide to stick with the dogma, we're screwed.
So that's my question: is how do we change that when they're already so embedded in the powerful institutions? When we have quangos that are deciding which adverts are good for us to see, and all that sort of stuff. It's so commonplace.
Yes.
And we don't have people in Parliament who are willing to stand up and make an anti-woke argument.
The problem is that it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? I mean, you're right. There are very good reasons to be positive. One, by the way, is simple. The title of your book, woke. A few years ago, woke was used as a term of approbation. Let me correct myself. A few years ago, when it started to sidle in, there were people, quite a lot of people, who would like to be thought of as woke.
Oh, yeah.
The term was positive.
Yes.
And then at some point, not unconnected with your own fury of a creation running straight at the general public, like an avenging angel, people didn't want to be thought of as woke. It took on other connotations. There was a pejorative to it. And I think that in itself is a positive, because it shows that these things can be turned around against people, that maybe you don't want to be seen as that.
Well, my favourite was Afua Hirsch in The Guardian, who wrote an article saying that the word woke is just a word that right-wingers use to describe, to denigrate social justice. And I replied to that tweet with a number of screenshots from The Guardian where woke was in the headline.
Yes.
How to find Mr. Woke.
Yeah,
and it's like, so maybe The Guardian is right-wing. I don't know.
Maybe. They create something and then pretend it's a figment of your imagination.
Yeah, that's it. And they're always going on about gaslighting, but they seem to do it more than anyone.
The number of terms now being thrown out, gaslighting. Anyhow, there are reasons to be positive about it. I just come back to this thing: if you're not in the fortunate position of being an independent-minded and, roughly speaking, self-employed person, there's a lot more pain to keep going through. But I come back to this thing: why? Because you mentioned the politicians. Why is it so hard for a politician to to withstand this. And I think there are reasons that are reasonable, as it were. I mean, one is none of them want to be caught on the wrong side, as many of them were on, for instance, gay issues in the past. They feel, again, this might be, trans may well be simply caught up in the overcorrection about gay. I think that's what's happening. But nobody wants to be caught on the wrong side of what might turn out to be, the wrong side of history. And so they, but here's another thing that there's simply a cost-benefit analysis, and I've had to spend quite a lot of my life with politicians of all different persuasions, and rowing with them, and falling out with them, and occasionally agreeing with them. But one thing I have noticed that I've always underestimated is the extent to which, in politics, a cost-benefit analysis goes on far more than I ever recognized. I could never understand why there were certain things that politicians wouldn't say. And it always comes down to the fact that there's very little to gain for it and a disproportionate amount to potentially lose. So that they simply weigh it up. And every time there's a crowd stampede on one of these issues, they weigh up, I could say something everyone knew till yesterday, I could say it today, and my career could be over tomorrow. Should I do it? The contrary position is, we all know we used to believe that yesterday. We all know most people don't believe that today, but we are being bullied today into saying it, and so in order to survive till tomorrow, I'll join in.
I get that. I mean, to give an example, I think most of us know that if we want to live in a free society, the price we pay for that is some people say bad things, say offensive things. But what would a politician have to gain to stand up in Parliament and say, we need to repeal our hate speech laws? Because, of course, the inevitable assault on that will be, you are therefore siding with the racists who want to say the horrible thing.
It wouldn't even be that. It would be, you must be a racist. But you must be trying to do racism again.
But on principle, given that we live in a country where 3,000 people are arrested every year for things they've said online that are deemed to be offensive, then this is something we should be addressing, surely.
Do you know, I don't think this country minds about free speech all that much. I don't think it's...
I hope you're wrong.
I'm just saying, I just don't think it does. I think we sort of pretend we do, and a small bunch of weirdos of us do. But
I'm one of them.
By and large, yeah, you and me both. But outside that weirdos brigade, the recent history suggests people are quite happy to be quiescent and would rather have a quiet life than stand up for this kind of principle. I come back to this thing. I'm forever comparing this country negatively to France in these regards. But when the Me Too thing started, and everyone knew that at the beginning these are some serious allegations that were being made and criminal charges to be brought into, a correction was needed. But when, as you could see quite early on, the whole thing started to overreach, and you got cases like the Ansari case in America, where comedians basically had a very unfortunate date, but it doesn't mean he should never be allowed to leave the house again. When these things happen, in Britain, basically, people did keep their heads down. We had nothing like the 100 prominent French women from all walks of life, including various friends of mine, among others. And there were people like Catherine Deneuve, very prominent actresses and philosophers and thinkers in France. 100 French female intellectuals and cultural figures sign a letter saying, no, the sexes need to get on. We cannot criminalize flirting. This has gone too far. You couldn't find 100 women in this country to do that. I'm sorry, you couldn't. Not of that level of prominence. Everyone in this country keeps their heads down on these things. It's been my experience throughout my life. It's been the experience of this country in each of the major free speech wars in recent years that, generally speaking, we continue to pretend that the people who are pointing to the issues, if they just went quiet and went away, we could all have our comfortable, quiet life again.
Can I give an example of something that might counter that bit?
Please.
Just so that, and this I think points to something, I think there has been a kind of cultural shift. If we go back to the Blair era, if we go back to New Labour, in 2005 they tried to introduce the Religious Discrimination Act. And what that would have meant was that if a comedian made a joke about a religion or mocked anyone's religion, then they would have been liable to prosecution. Now, that didn't pass, but by a very small minority.
One vote, because Tony Blair himself didn't turn up.
Always a good thing.
And we had the might of Rowan Atkinson on our side.
So this was my point. So we had basically a concerted effort amongst prominent comedians, spearheaded by Rowan Atkinson, to say, no, this is too much. This is a sledgehammer to crack a nut. This is not something we should be getting behind. Fast forward to our time, and you have the Count Dankula case, the Nazi pug case, where someone makes an obvious joke in a video and he's prosecuted, and that goes to court, 2-year trial, found guilty. Comedians, totally silent. Now, what I'm saying is I think something has changed in that intervening time period.
Well, this is why the target selection on this is so damn clever. The problem is that most people don't have time in the day to work out if the Glaswegian YouTube shitposter is a Nazi or not.
Right.
My presumption in most cases is not to assume everyone is a Nazi until they prove otherwise, but we do live in a culture which takes the contrary point of view on that. Assume Nazism on everyone's behalf until they prove absolute ideological cleanliness. And we don't know quite how you do it, but how does the Count Dankula guy get out of it? He appears to be trying to bring back Nazism through the means of his girlfriend's dog, which is weird.
Well, particularly since the Gestapo arrested a man during the war for teaching their dog to do a Nazi salute. So, but even the Gestapo let that go. But the Scottish judiciary, they took it all the way. You know,
they took it all the way.
I mean, that's a very funny one, because the Cybercrime Intelligence Unit investigated him for 2 years, read all his emails, all his texts. They found no evidence whatsoever of far-right leanings, but because the Guardian's got a hunch, you know, we just assume.
Well, but this is a serious problem built into this, because the few weirdos among us, most of whom will be here over the course of this weekend, will stand up for the Nazi pug-themed Glaswegian shitposter guy on the principle, and because then you have to look into it a bit. But assuming that most people don't have the time or the energy to do that, they just think, I don't know that I want to do it, because otherwise, if he does turn out to be a Nazi, which again, I don't think he does, but if he does, then you're stuck with Nazi pug dog salute guy. And then... Well, what was the point of that?
It makes it seem so frivolous, doesn't it? All this stuff is about such silly things, but actually the principle is so serious. It isn't about a dog and a salute. It's about what it represents, you know.
And the problem I have, and I've discussed this a little bit recently, is how could we see? Because this happens an awful lot. This has happened an awful lot, and in my life, whenever it's happened to somebody I know, I've always come out fighting for them as hard as I can. It happened recently to my friend Roger Scruton. It happened some years ago to my friend Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And I always fight to defend them because they're my friends, and I know it's a lie. But here's the problem. Most people aren't in that situation. Most people don't have anyone who can come out and fight on their side, or they don't have anyone with platforms to come out on their side, or with any credibility, as it were. And they don't, and the person who the accusations are being made of doesn't have any significant body of work to go to. So you just don't know. I mean, there was a case with the Asda supermarket worker recently who was fired for liking this Billy Connolly video, and of course, that also demonstrates the retreat. I mean, Billy Connolly makes one joke about Islam 15 years ago or 10 years ago or something, and it's so unusual that it occasionally goes around the internet again as people, you know, just are quite pleased that there's a guy laughing at suicide bombers because nobody else has the guts to do that, which is pretty damn amazing just to start with. But this thing goes around the internet sometimes. It goes around and the guy at Asda likes it. Bang, he's fired. Well, again, the guy at Asda isn't in a circle of writers and thinkers and doesn't have... And then you're like, do I have time to dig through the Asda supermarket workers' back Facebook stuff?
Yeah. This is why I think we're quite privileged in a way that we do say what we want and we can. But I always think about this. If I was still working as a teacher, I wouldn't make jokes. I wouldn't tweet the way that I tweet.
Well, here's one way you could start to address this. Everybody, everywhere, stand up for your mates.
Yeah,
When you know
totally
they're
agree.
being lied about.
Yeah.
Always do that.
Yeah.